everyone, I'm Solange. Today I'm going to be presenting on psilocybin and its relationship to anxiety and depression. So the first question that you may have is, what is psilocybin? I was completely unfamiliar with the term before this research project, and the short answer is that psilocybin is shrooms. But the long and more scientific answer is that psilocybin is the primary chemical compound found in what is colloquially known as magic mushrooms. So psilocybin, when ingested, can produce pretty intense effects on the mind. So people who take mushrooms will experience senses of euphoria, hallucinations, distortions of time, space, and vision. It can also produce some adverse effects like nausea and panic attacks. And part of the reason psilocybin has such an intense relationship to the mind is because it agonizes the serotonin 2A receptors. And because of psilocybin's sort of impactful, or because of the way that it interacts with thoughts and behaviors, it's been the subject of research. And one of the studies that I'm really excited to present today is looking at the effects of psilocybin on anxiety and depression in terminally ill patients. Before we get started, I'll just talk a little about the roadmap for this presentation. So first I'm going to look at the progression of psilocybin research, so what it looked like 50, 60 years ago and what it looks like today. And then we're going to look at the study that, again, looked at the effects of psilocybin as a form of treatment for symptoms of anxiety and depression in terminally ill patients. So in talking about the history of psilocybin, it's really important to note that ingestion of mushrooms is not something that is new. It's been going on for non-Western countries for thousands of years, or non-Western cultures for thousands of years. But it only really hit the United States cultural conscious in like the 40s or 50s. And pharmaceutical companies actually asked institutions to look at the potential medical benefits of psilocybin, which resulted in a lot of research in the 50s and 60s looking at psychedelics. And what's especially relevant to us is that Harvard had the Harvard Psilocybin Project. And that was kind of pioneered by Timothy Lear and Richard Alpert. And this project kind of became infamous. There were some questions of ethics and legitimacy, but it was really experimental at the time. So they had all these new psychedelics. They weren't really sure what the potential medical benefits were. They weren't really sure what was actually happening in the mind. And so really everyone was just taking a lot of shrooms and LSD, which is pretty cool for research and also seeped into mainstream culture. And then you had the development in the 60s of this like counterculture psychedelic movement, which is associated with music and art and hippies and the civil rights, also associated with a lot of anti-war protests and anti-government sentiments. Which also prompted the government to then crack down on psychedelics and other drugs. And so in 1970, psilocybin was made completely illicit, in part because of Richard Nixon and his war on drugs campaign. And so this basically stops research for decades because it's impossible, because it's illegal, to actually have any sort of research related to these illicit drugs. And so research picked up again in like 2008 in Europe, and then has kind of, by 2011, institutions in America started to use psilocybin and other psychedelics in their research. But it looks really different now than it did back then. So back then it was really experimental. So since this was an entirely new entity, a lot of the research was just seeing what happened. And today it's kind of moved to becoming a little more intentional and focus on psychopharmacology. So looking specifically at the therapeutic effects of psilocybin and other hallucinogenics. So the study that I'll be presenting, so it's from Johns Hopkins University. It was published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology in 2016. And it's called "Psilocybin Produces Substantial and Sustained Decreases in Depression and Anxiety in Patients with Life-Threatening Cancer, a Randomized Double-Blind Trial." So I bolded substantial and sustained because I think those are the two kind of goals of this study. Because again, psilocybin research is pretty new. This is one of 3 studies that have been related to psilocybin and anxiety and depression in terminally ill patients. And so this is also the first study that is looking at substantive change, so it uses the most psilocybin of any research study, and also sustained change. So this study examines over the course of 9 months, which is also kind of different. So the study took 51 participants, and you can see that it's a pretty homogenized group. It's about 50% women, 94% white, and 88% college educated. What is really specific about this population, though, is that they were all terminally ill, and they were all diagnosed with either anxiety or depression. And so these 51 participants were split into two groups. There was a low-dose first group and a high-dose first group. So the course of the study, basically these participants received 2 sessions of a psilocybin experience, I guess you'd call it. And so if you were in the low-dose first group, you had a low dose of psilocybin administered in your first session and then a higher dose. The low dose was 1 milligram and the high dose was 20 milligrams of psilocybin, which is a lot, I have learned. And so if you were in the high-dose first group, you had the 20 milligrams first, and then the 1 milligram first, and 1 milligram second. And the 1 milligram was supposed to act as a control and sort of just a way to see how your body just responds. And so it's also really important to understand what these sessions actually were. So they were given the psilocybin in gelatin capsules, and then they were put in a room with a couch and someone to monitor them. They were given eye masks to kind of blur out any visual distractions, and then they were also given headphones playing instrumental pre-selected music to guide them in this. And they weren't given any specific directive advice to think about certain things, but they were told to reflect a little internally and see just like where the experience took them. And data was collected using self-reported surveys, and it's also really important to, actually, first we're going to talk about the timeline, because that is more important than talking about the surveys. So at 0 weeks, the participants enrolled in the study. A month later, they had their first session, and then a month after that, they had their first session evaluation. A week later, they would have their second session of psilocybin, and then a month after that, they would have their post-session 2 evaluation. And then 6 months after that, they would have their final evaluation, which was 9 months after the initial enrollment in the study. And so again, it is important to ask what types of surveys were used, and so they were trying to understand what the effects of psilocybin are and also how it changes anxiety and depression. So they used a lot of indexes that are pretty similar to the one that we took in class, and I'll be talking about a few of them, but they used, I think, a total a dozen to kind of get a feel of like what is happening in the experience, and then also what are the specific individual manifestations of anxiety and how did they change. And the results were pretty outstanding. So this is the STI trait anxiety, so again, another example of one of the surveys. And you can see that there is the significant decrease in anxiety, but also the sustained change in anxiety. And the red is the high-dose group, the blue is the low-dose group. So you can also see that the high-dose group experiences this change first. But by the time the 6 months have gone by, they're around the same. And same thing goes for depression. So this is the Beck Depression Inventory. And again, you see the significant and then sustained change in depressive symptoms. And then one that I found just particularly interesting was death acceptance, so how these terminally ill patients then conceptualize death. And you see that there is a significant, again, increase in just death acceptance, which I think is pretty cool. And their biggest 2 takeaways from this survey is that first, so 78% of participants after the 9 months reported being less depressed than they were when the survey started, and 83% of participants reported being less anxious than when the survey started. So what are the implications and limitations of this? So like I mentioned, this is one of 3 surveys that have really looked at terminally ill patients and what happens when they ingest psilocybin and how that affects their anxiety and depression. And it's basically affirmed what the other 2 studies have found. What is unique about this study is that they do use 20 milligrams of psilocybin. Most of the time it's about 3 milligrams. So it shows that high quantities are really effective, and since this research is in its early stages, I think just sort of paves the way for more research to be done. That being said, it is in its early stages, so there are a lot of questions to ask. First of all, the group is really homogeneous, so how does psilocybin maybe affect lines along geography or class or race? The second is that psilocybin in the study was also used as the control, so it would have been nice if they had used a placebo just to see the significant difference between the 2. But hopefully, as research progresses, we'll be able to ask more specific questions and see how psilocybin might be used even in non-extreme populations, so maybe people who just experience anxious or depressive symptoms.